You are 11 years old. The smell of roses clings heavily to the air, mingled with incense that makes your head spin. Servants rush about, their silk slippers whispering against the marble floors. A crown of gold, far too large for your small head, presses painfully into your scalp. The palace is glowing tonight, lit with hundreds of candles and oil lamps. Musicians pluck their strings, and the low hum of voices trembles like a storm about to break. From the outside, it looks like the celebration of Alaf time. Guests dressed in jewels and velvet smile polite, lie as they wait for the procession. They are not here for you, they are here for the alliance your marriage will seal. At 11 years old, you should be climbing trees, chasing birds, giggling with your friends, or falling asleep with your mother's slow ABEs still lingering in your ears. But tonight, childhood ends. Tonight you are a bride. The gown they wrapped around you is beautiful. Yes, but it is heavy, suffocating, embroidered with pearls and threaded with silver. It is the kind of garment meant to be admired, not worn by Occult who still stumbles when she walks too quickly. Your hands tremble beneath the silk sleeves, not because of the weight of the fabric, but because of the weight of expectation. Your father, stern and unyielding, looks down at you as if you are no longer his daughter but a pawn he has moved across the board. Your mother says are glassy. Perhaps she is remembering her own childhood that ended too soon. The courtiers whisper in the shadows. Some pity you, others envy the fortune they believe has been bestowed upon you. None will stop this. The doors of the great hall swing open. At the far end of the aisle stands a man who could be your father or even your grandfather. His robe is crimson, his beard streaked with gray. His eyes study you not with affection, but with calculation. He is not marrying a girl, he is marrying a treaty, a dowry, an alliance. You are the vessel. The music swells and you are pushed forward. Each step feels like ell of time. The cold marble beneath your sleepers reminding you that this is no dream. You clutch the bouquet tighter, your knuckles pale. Around you, nobles murmur blessings, priests chant prayers. To them, this is divine will. To you, it is the end of something precious you cannot name. As you stand before the altar, your gaze wanders for a final time. The windows are tall and unyielding, trapping the night sky outside. Somewhere in the courtyard, a child's slaughter echoes faintly, a reminder of a world you no longer belong to. The priest's voice rises, so amen and unshakable. The man beside, UCLA SPS, your small hand in his large, calloused one. The ring slips easily onto your thin finger, heavy as iron shackles. The crowd erupts in cheers. You are 11 years old, and you have just been bound not only to a man but to a kingdom's destiny. Before we continue with her tragic story, take a moment to support this channel. If you enjoy uncovering the forgotten lives of those who lived and suffered before us, please subscribe and click the bell icon. Every story like this deserves to be remembered, and your support helps keep history alive. Now, back to our queen. She was not born into an ordinary family. Her cradle was carved from cedar, draped with silks imported from faraway lands. Servants sang her law ABEs in languages she could not yet understand. From the very beginning, her life belonged not to herself, but to her dynasty. In palaces like hers, daughters were not daughters. They were investments, they were do-rise, they were bargaining chips moved across the board of kingdoms. Her birth was celebrated, not because she was occult to be loved, but because she might one day secure alliances with rival rulers, while common children ran barefoot through fields, laughing under the sun. Her days were carefully measured tutors, taught her how to speak with elegance, how to bow with grace, how to write letters that would one day flatter foreign kings. She learned the delicate art of embroidery not as a hobby, but as a symbol of refinement, proof that she could please a future husband. But she was still occult. She adored the bright colors of birds in the palace gardens. She giggled when the court jester stumbled over his own shoes. She whispered secrets to her dolls, carved from ivory and wood. Her world, though gilded, was still a world of innocence. The kingdom in which she was born was not at peace. Rival nobles schemed for influence. Neighboring empires loomed on the horizon, and every marriage was weighed like a treaty. Sons were prized for carrying the bloodline forward. Daughters were currency for survival. When she was only 5, her future was already sealed. Whispers passed through the corridors. She will marry for Fauchereau. Negotiations had begun before. She even learned to read. By the age of 7, she was paraded before foreign envoys, dressed in miniature gowns. She curtsied with trembling knees while old men examined her like a horse at market. They smiled, commented on her fine posture, her delicate features, and her suitable demeanor. She did not understand then that they were appraising not her beauty, but her value. At 9, she was betrothed. The DEA contract was signed. A gem of gold, a promise of soldiers, a clause of loyalty. On paper, her fate was inked in black and red. She, meanwhile, was still playing with her ivory dolls. The cruelest part of her story is not that she lacked freedom, it is that she never even knew freedom was possible. From birth, the palace walls enclosed her. Every word she spoke was measured. Every movement was corrected. Every dream she formed was quietly reshaped into obedience. Once she whispered to her nursemaid that she wanted to ride beyond the gates, to see the villages where ordinary children lived. The nursemaid smiled subtly and said, "A queen has no need to wander." And so, the idea of choice withered. She never imagined a life where she could say no. When the day came that her parents announced she was to be wed, she did not scream or protest. She lowered her eyes, folded her hands, and whispered, "Yes, father." Even before the wedding, she had seen him from afar, a man far older, his presence filled with authority. To her young eyes, he seemed like a towering figure, a symbol of destiny more than a husband. She tried to imagine walking beside him, but the image felt absurd, like a bird chained to a mountain. Her tutors reminded her daily, "Your duty is to obey. Your duty is to honor him. Your duty is to give him sons." The words sank deep, forming chains around her mind long before the wedding band locked around her finger. On the eve of her marriage, she sat at her chamber window. The moonlight painted the garden silver. She pressed her face to the glass, watching the fireflies dart between the roses. Somewhere in the distance, she heard children laughing. For a brief moment, she imagined she was among them barefoot, free, nameless. But behind her, the chambermaids were already preparing the gown. The seamstress adjusted the bodice, muttering about how small her frame was. The dew wager and scold at her for slouching, for fidgeting, for looking out the window, instead of practicing her vows. She was only 11, and yet tomorrow she would be called queen. The morning of her wedding dawned with the sound of bells, but to her young ears, they were not bells of celebration. They were iron chains clanging shut. They placed her in a gown that seemed to swallow her. Whole layers of silk and brocade weighed heavily on her thin shoulders. Jewels glittered on her head, so heavy she could hardly lift her neck. Her attendants smiled and whispered, "How beautiful, how radiant, how lucky." But she was not lucky. She was 11, and every stitch of that gown felt less like fabric and more like a shroud. The court painters later record at the image. A pale-faced bride, eyes lowered, lips pressed into obedience. They painted her as a symbol of unity between kingdoms. They never painted the fear in her chest, the way her hands trembled inside the sleeves, or the tears she swallowed as the crown was set upon her head. The cathedral was overflowing, nobles in scarlet and gold, bishops in jeweled mitres, knights in polished armor, all eyes fixed upon the child walking down the long aisle. She walked slowly, each step echoing in the silence. To the crowd, she was the embodiment of dynastic glory. To herself, she was a bird being carried into a cage. The groom stood waiting at the altar, a man seasoned by war and politics, his face lined with years she could not count. He looked not at her, but at the treaty behind her, the alliance she embodied. When the bishop spoke the sacred words, her voice was barely a whisper. She repeated phrases she scarcely understood, phrases of loyalty, obedience, and eternal devotion. The crowd heard the words, only she knew they were hollow. Her father nodded with satisfaction. The rival nobles sighed with relief. The kingdom secured its future in that whispered yes. But the girl herself, she never said yes in her heart. She only said it because she had been taught that saying no was unthinkable. As the rings were exchanged, applause erupted, trumpets blared. The people outside cheered, tossing flowers into the air. For them, this was a triumph, a spectacle ending of power. For her, it was an ending. Childhood ended at the altar. The moment the crown was placed upon her head, the dolls in her chamber ceased to matter. The games, the laughter, the dreams, all vanished beneath the weight of her title. She was no longer a daughter, no longer a child. She was a queen, but a queen who had no power. That night, while the city celebrated with feasts and fireworks, she sat silently in a grand chamber beside Amon. She barely knew the bed was enormous, the candles flickering like silent waiting as she was dressed again, not in silk this time, but in trembling silence. History does not tell us the exact details. The Chronicle RS, bound by politeness, only wrote, "The marriage was consummated, but we can imagine the terror of an 11-year-old forced into a role she could neither refuse nor comprehend. Behind the closed doors, she became not only a queen, but also a possession. The palace, with all its gilded halls and marble corridors, became her prison. Though she wore the crown, she discovered quickly it was an empty symbol. Real power rested with her husband, the council, and the men who surrounded her. Every decision was made without her voice. Every decree carried her name, but never her will. When she tried to speak, she was gently silenced. When she asked questions, she was told, "These matters are not for a child." To the court, she was a figurehead. To the people, she was a storybook queen. To herself, she was invisible. Her days followed an endless cycle: drawn prayers, court audiences, banquets, ceremonies. She had to memorize gestures, postures, and phrases, until every movement of her body became scripted performance. She was praised for her grace, but it was grace carved by fear. A single mistake, a misplaced smile, a stumble during a procession, could be whispered into scandal. The laughter of childhood had been replaced by Here's Ed's smiles that hurt her cheeks. Her chambers glittered with chandeliers, tapestries, and gold, but she lived in silence. The dolls she once cherished were long gone. In their place stood portraits of stern ancestors, staring down from the walls as if to remind her that she existed only to serve a dynasty. At night, she walked alone through endless corridors echo, in with her footsteps. The guards bowed. The maids curtsied, but none were companions. She had no friends her own age. She had no confidants who could understand the weight on her shoulders. The girl who once played in gardens now sat in silence, staring out of palace windows, watching the city children laugh, freely in the streets below. The court demanded heirs. Whispers grew louder. When will the queen give us a child? But she was still accused. Herself, her body was frail, unprepared, and each expectation was another, weight crushing her spirit. Chroniclers wrote of her delicate health. Behind those words lay suffering, physical exhaustion, miscarriages, endless prayers for fertility. She bore the shame of what was never her fault. Every failure to conceive was not her own failure, but the failure of the kingdom's fragile peace. Her husband, far older and far more experienced in politics, treated her less as a partner and more as a possession. She was displayed at feasts, seated beside him like a jewel to impress foreign dignitaries. She was forced to endure his temper, his lovers, and the mocking whispers of courtiers who saw her as too young, too weak, too irrelevant. Letters from ambassadors described her as obedient and melancholy. In other words, broken. Years passed, but she never truly grew into her crown. Instead, the crown grew heavier, crushing what remained of her youth. Her diaries, if they had survived, might have told us of her private despair. Instead, history records her only through the eyes of others, men who judged her, chroniclers who excused her husband, courtiers who erased her humanity. To them she was not a suffering child. She was simply the queen, but we looking back can see the truth. Her reign was not a fairy tale, it was a sentence. Her body never fully recovered from the years of pressure, expectations, and forced maturity by her late teens, while most young women were just beginning to dream of their futures. Her health had already collapsed. The physicians prescribed endless tonics, prayers, and pilgrimages, but nothing could cure what had been broken long ago. A childhood stolen, a spirit crushed, a life never truly her own. When she failed to provide a stable heir, whispers turned into accusations. Some called her cursed, others saw her as a weak link in the royal line. What few understood, or chose not to admit, was that she had never been given a chance. How could a girl married at 11, trapped in ceremonies, drained by miscarriages, and deprived of love, ever fulfill the expectations of an empire? Yet history is rarely merciful, and in the eyes of her contemporaries, the fault was hers alone. Her final days were not spent surrounded by affection but in seclusion, fading quietly while the court prepared itself to replace her. Some chronicles record that she died before she reached her 20s. Others suggest she lived slightly longer, but never with joy. In either case, her end came too soon, before she could ever live free, before she could ever escape the shadow of her crown. The child who had once been promised a life of glory instead found only suffering and then oblivion. The official records called her a queen. They noted her marriage, her ceremonial duties, and her inability to secure a dynasty. They described her as dutiful, gentle, and pious. But these words were not praise. They were epitaphs carved by others, reducing her to a role, not a human being. She was remembered not for what she achieved, but for what she could not achieve, not for who she was, but for what she failed to deliver. Centuries later, we look back at her life and see the tragedy more clearly than her contemporaries did. She was not simply a queen. She was an 11-year-old girl, torn from her innocence, forced into a marriage she did not choose, and crushed under the weight of an empire's demands. Her story reminds us of countless others, women erased by history, read only as footnotes to men's power, and forgotten before they were ever allowed to live. The tragic life of the queen who was forced to marry at 11 is not just history, it is a mirror, reflecting the cruelty of systems that value dynasties over lives, thrones over children, and appearances over humanity. When we think of her, we should not remember a crown. We should remember a child who never had the chance to grow up.